And volume 3, forthcoming here, passageways since 1965. And then, too, a history of the Caribbean peoples. And from indentured servitude to slavery, the worlds of human exploitation, 1500 to 1800. I hope you were able to digest all of this, because not too many people produce this kind of work. It really is special. And we're talking only about published books. There's a long list of articles and book reviews and just about everything else you would expect from a truly distinguished person. So without any additional delay, please, Professor Colin Palmer.
Thank you very much for your very generous introduction. And thank you all for inviting me. And I'm pleased to be here tonight to actually have a conversation with you. When Professor Palmer called and asked if I would come, I wondered what I might talk to you about, what might be an appropriate topic that would bridge Africa with the Americas, because I was told that this is an African history class primarily, at least the audience will be drawn primarily from a class that meets at this hour. So I suggested the African origins of African Americans. And what I want to do tonight is to discuss where African Americans came from. That's the first part of the talk. And the second part will be to link Africa with the Americas by way of the Middle Passage, or as I prefer to call it, the First Passage. I'll try to keep you for maybe 2 or 3 hours tonight. I hope you don't have any plans. And since you're so polite, you won't walk out either, right? But we'll see how it goes. As we speak tonight, at this hour, there are probably about 150 million peoples of African descent living in the Americas. That is to say, living in North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean, 150 million. Brazil, as some of you probably know, has the largest number, probably between 75 and 80 million people of African descent live in Brazil today. The United States has somewhere between 35 and 40 million. The Caribbean islands, Jamaica, Cuba, and so on, as well as those countries that comprise the Caribbean basin, those societies have approximately 30 million residents who can claim an African ancestry. And the remainder are residents of such countries as Canada, Peru, Argentina, and so on. But taken together, there are about 150 million peoples of African descent in this hemisphere. And that figure of 150 million is roughly 1/3 in terms of population, 1/3 the size of the population on the African continent, which numbers, give you a math, 450 million people, just about. Now, historians believe that the number of African peoples who came to the Americas rests somewhere between 11.5 and 13 million. That is to say, between 11.5 and 13 million people came off those ships. And as you are already aware, the slave trade to the Americas begins in 1502. That was the year when the first African slaves came. They came to the island of Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And you probably also know that the last slave ship to the Americas sailed in 1870. So between 1502 and 1870, somewhere between 11.5 and 13 million African peoples arrived in the hemisphere. This figure, I hasten to add, does not include those who died before the Middle Passage began. It does not include those who died on the African coast. And some recent historians have suggested that at certain periods, probably as high as 50% of the captured peoples died before they left Africa, died while they waited in the dungeons in Ghana or Senegal or Angola and so on. We know that the mortality rate during the crossing to the Americas was also quite high. In the 16th century, that is say 1520, 1530, 1540, the mortality rate may have been as high as 50%. By the 18th century, this mortality rate fell to somewhere between 15 and 20%. And by the 19th century, the mortality rate further diminished to between 5 and 10%. So taken together, if you include those who died before they left Africa, those who died during the Middle Passage or the First Passage, and those who survived the 11.5 to 13 million, probably as many as 20 or 22 million Africans were enslaved. And I stress the word probably because we will never know for sure, although we have some very good estimates now. In fact, Professor Gates at Harvard University and a team of other scholars have just released 27,000 slave voyages. It's on a CD-ROM. So we now have some firm documentation for reconstructing the lives of these enslaved peoples, their sexual composition, their gender, their ages, where they came from, and so on. But we will never have an exact figure. We will have reasonably good estimates. Now, where did these 11.5 to 13 million persons go? How were they distributed in the Americas? It shouldn't surprise you to know that Brazil received the largest number of these enslaved Africans. Brazil received somewhere between 4 and 5 million, the largest number. And that between 4 and 5 million now numbers, as I said, somewhere between 70 and 80, based upon demographic increase. The British Caribbean islands, Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, and so on, those islands obtained about 2.7 million Africans. The Spanish colonies, and by that I mean the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Mexico, Peru, Argentina, and so on, those Spanish colonies received approximately 2 million. The Danish Caribbean, that is to say St. Croix, the islands that the United States bought from Denmark, St. Croix, St. Thomas, and so on, those received approximately 50 million. But get this, this might surprise you, only about 500,000 slaves came to the United States, or came to what is now North America. 5% of the total number. The other 95% went to tropical America, went to Brazil, to Barbados, to Cuba, to Jamaica, to Martinique, to Guadeloupe, and so on. Only 5% came here. But what is interesting about the United States or about North America is that this was the only slave society that had a sustained rate of natural increase. The only society where the slave population was able to reproduce itself. And this began around the 1730s. Prior to the 1730s, more slaves were dying each year than were being born. But beginning around the 1730s, the black population begins to reproduce itself, and one finds an annual rate of natural increase. So that by 1820, 90 years or so later, 80% of the slaves were born right here. There were Creoles, there were Americans, who straddled African cultures and the culture of the Americas. But nevertheless, there were Americans that were as American as any other group of people who could claim, quote, citizenship on this soil. In fact, the black population, the slave population in this country increased by almost 250% between 1820 and 1860, just before the Civil War broke out. One of the highest rates of natural increase that any population could register in the, or has registered in the world. So that when the Civil War breaks out, there were approximately 4 million slaves and 500,000 free people. So that 500,000 that I'm talking about, that 5%, becomes 4.5 million by 1860. And becomes 35 or 40 million today. Now, if we had time, we would get into a discussion as to why the black population here was unlike any other in terms of its capacity to reproduce itself. There are several explanations for this. One, of course, is that when a population begins to reproduce itself naturally, there is usually parity in terms of the genders. And when you have a situation of parity in terms of gender, that facilitates reproduction. Secondly, certain diseases that were present in societies like Brazil were not present in North America. So the disease environment also helps to explain the capacity of American slaves to reproduce themselves in a sustained fashion. Okay, that's the general background. What I want to turn to is, where did these 500,000 slaves come from? What parts of Africa? And I know your textbooks will say they all came from West Africa. And some of the old-fashioned professors will still keep saying that. But modern research has shed some interesting light on the ethnic origins, the geographic regions from which people came. So I want to spend the next 5 minutes or so discussing the areas of Africa from which African Americans descended. For those of you who like catchy kinds of phrases or little sound bites, the majority of the African slaves who came to the Americas came from a region bounded by the Senegal River in the north and extending 300 miles or so into the interior and continuing all the way down to what is now Angola. From the River Senegal in the north to Angola